Good morning, good afternoon. My name is Blair and welcome to Futures, where we talk about everything youth justice. I'm really excited for our host today, Dr. Kaliebe, but first I'm going to introduce our founder of Prison Yoga Project, James Fox. James Fox is the founder of Prison Yoga Project. He began his mission of sharing the benefits of yoga with incarcerated people at San Quentin Prison, where he has taught classes since 2002. Based on his experience, he began offering special teacher training in 2011. As a result, he has been instrumental in establishing yoga programs throughout the US, Mexico, Europe, and Australia. He is the former program director for a leading restorative justice organization and has experience facilitating victim offender education, emotional literacy, and violence prevention courses with prisoners. He's the author of Yoga, A Path for Healing and Recovery, and co-author of Freedom from the Inside, a women's yoga practice guide. Thank you, James, so much for being here.
Thank you, Blair, and welcome everybody. I'm very happy to have this opportunity to talk with Dr. Kaliebe, and I think maybe what I'll do is I'll start. I actually call him Chris, but I'll start by reading his bio, and then Chris will do a short centering practice with us before we get started. Dr. Kristopher Kaliebe is a graduate of Columbia University and St. George's University School of Medicine. He's an Associate Professor of Psychiatry at the University of South Florida. He's board certified in psychiatry, child and adolescent psychiatry, and forensic psychiatry. Dr. Kaliebe is a distinguished fellow and serves as co-chair of the media committee at the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry. His clinical work has been primarily in university clinics, federally qualified health centers, and juvenile corrections. Since 2016, Dr. Kaliebe has helped start and maintain yoga programs within the correctional centers where he works. And since 2020, he's served on the board of directors of Yoga for Change. Dr. Kaliebe has extensive training in psychotherapy, including trauma-focused therapies, and he's been named as a best doctor annually since 2008. So I'm happy to introduce Chris, and if you'd please start us off with a centering practice.
All right, so thank you for the introduction, and I guess we can start with some taking a couple deep breaths and letting ourselves relax and be present. And why don't we just close our eyes on the next breath, and we can scan down our bodies, starting at the top of our heads, through our face, through our neck, through our shoulders, arms, through our hands, down our chest, through our midsection, through our hips, lower back, through our legs, through our knees and calves, through our feet. Just notice how we feel. Notice anything good or bad that's going on in our bodies. Notice our breath going in and out. And tune into whatever signals our body are sending us. Notice any thoughts coming and going in our minds, not getting attached to them. Noticing any sounds, smells in our environment. Let's just have a couple more breaths, noticing where we're at. And back to the room, your eyes, feel what's around you. and hopefully we're feeling centered and ready to go. I'm often working with the kids in corrections, so depending on where they're at, it may be my centering practices may be shorter than some others.
Yeah. Thank you for that. So I thought I'd start out by mentioning how we originally met. I met you back in 2016 when I taught a teacher training in Tampa. And I was elated to find out that you were a psychiatrist at the time and that you were working as the head of mental health for the juvenile facility in Tampa. So as far as today is concerned, I thought maybe I'd ask you to start out by asking you a little bit about your background and what motivated you to become a psychiatrist and then to end up focusing on youth.
Okay. Well, I had a circuitous journey, so I didn't always grow up wanting to be a physician or a psychiatrist. And, my parents were sort of more in the middle socioeconomic group, but they sent us to private school. So I grew up with lots of friends whose parents were doctors. So I had some exposure to like families of doctors, but it never really appealed to me and never really wanted to go into it. But when I was in college, I did think, well, this whole science thing is really interesting and it'd be really practical. I'll be a biochemistry major. So I was a biochemistry major in college and didn't really know what I was getting into. And at this point, I love science and probably like understand the process more and would find it really interesting. But I probably was just too high energy and not, it didn't fit me like working in the lab. And then I sort of was considering medical school. I kind of didn't know what I was going to do or wasn't strongly committed to it. And I did take a couple years after college and sort of wandered around and did some other things and ended up going back. And St. George's is a medical school in Grenada. So I went to medical school overseas for like at least the first part, which was actually a magical experience. And I think helped me, be a better doctor in a lot of ways. And having that extra time of a couple years, my dad was a voracious reader and we always had like intellectual conversations in the house, but I kind of was a late bloomer. I was a kind of a lazy student and, squandered a lot of my potential in some ways. I was more into sports than, studying when I was a kid. And, so it ended up that I got to medical school at a time that was a little later than some people, but it wasn't super late. But at that point, I was really motivated and gung-ho about, performing, doing well. And so, I kind of peaked right at medical school in terms of my effort and interest in actual formal schooling. And so that worked out well because you really need to be in that place, when you go to medical school. I had some other possibilities, but I always kind of thought psychiatry was just the most interesting of all the fields. I mean, it's fascinating, all the layers of the onion that you can look at, and there's you're trying to size up, like when someone comes to you for help, what is their problem? What are they interested in working on? What do you think down the road maybe you could get them more interested in working on? What type of, is this more like would they respond to a medication? Would they respond to psychotherapy? Would they respond to lifestyle interventions? Is this a family systems case really? Is there an environmental problem? Is it trauma? Is it a primary brain problem that was there, from birth? I mean, all those things like mixed together almost in every single patient to some degree. So, it's a really complex, interesting field. And I always was just really, once I got to that place, I was always really interested in it. And I love to read. I read a lot. And still have a stack of books and I'm carrying through audiobooks these days. And so I'm kind of a lifelong learner and it really fits in psychiatry because there's just so much to learn. You can never stop. Yeah.
Well, I know that before you moved to Tampa, you were living in New Orleans. Is that where you grew up?
Well, so I'm living on the same block that I grew up on in Tampa. So that's how I got back to Tampa. My mom lives 14 houses down from us. So, I kind of came back to Tampa, and that's where I grew up. But so I went to college in New York City, and then I, traveled around and medical school, and we were in England a little during medical school, and then I was in Jersey for adult psychiatry. But I really love New Orleans, and I have friends there and music, and I had all sorts of things, Sazeracs. I mean, there were all these things that made me want to go to New Orleans. So I went there for my child psychiatry fellowship. That was in 2002. So that's 2 years. And then I did forensic psychiatry there. That was another year. And then I started on staff at LSU, half-time in juvenile corrections and half-time working at primary care clinics, federally qualified health centers. And I was about 2 months into my job when Katrina hit. So Katrina, flooded the city, and then we were kind of near, I'd already now been there for over 3 years. And it was kind of like you dig in and you stay for a long time and help rebuild, or you leave town. So, I felt like we wanted to stay and dig in, and ended up being I was 11 years on staff at LSU. And sort of New Orleans fits me a little bit better than Tampa in some ways. I mean, I love Tampa, but there's like a grittiness, and there's the music, and there's just a lot of real culture. So I learned a lot being there, and I think I couldn't be the same person I was today if I would have stayed in Tampa the whole time, or if there's plenty of places where I think you can, some of these older towns have like their own culture, and the layers to them are much more interesting than some of the newer towns. So I'm like, okay, my theory is I could bring some of the good stuff that New Orleans has, to Tampa. That's my hope. That's part of my hope. So.
Well, I know from our experience that Louisiana is one of those states in the U.S. that has a very high incarceration rate. It's also a state where the incarceration, in terms of the population, the incarceration heavily skews toward African American. I mean, probably even more than the national average, which is 40% of people who are incarcerated are African American, and I would guess it would be even higher there. I'm wondering, I don't know if there would be a comparison of the kind of issues that you were dealing with, particularly in forensic psychiatry. Any difference between what you were dealing with when you were in New Orleans and what you're dealing with in Tampa, or if there's a similarity?
Well, I do think there are differences for sure. I mean, just like you mentioned, the demographic groups in the different states are different, right? So you have a lot larger Hispanic and a more diverse group in Florida. So you have a culturally different, I mean, there's, New Orleans and Louisiana is sort of more, although it's diverse, it's more sort of white and black. Whereas Florida has it's more Hispanic and other populations. Florida is also geographically, obviously, very spread out and has a larger population. I think you're correctly identifying that part of what's, a major challenge in Louisiana is historically there's been these large divisions, and there's large populations of sort of underclass or disadvantaged populations that really struggle, and the correctional system reflects it. It's a overly punitive system, I think, for sure. Yet there really is a severe crime problem too. And so it's one of those tough situations of you do really have to watch yourself in Louisiana and in New Orleans more, because it's a much higher crime area, and people are really, and there's a lot of trauma. So it's all these big cycles of trauma. The kids are growing up, experiencing, seeing dead bodies, and seeing people, who are in their family who have, either been locked up or have been victims of crime. And so it's just the whole cycle is much more concentrated and more difficult in Louisiana. But as you were saying, the state has failed to, respond as well as they could have to all these problems. They're very entrenched and have been going on for a long time. And Florida's kind of a newer state. and it has a lot of those same problems, but probably more spread out. It has more resources. It's a richer state, but I would say they're very comparable, and they tend to be low taxes, low services kind of states in general. And that transfers to the juvenile justice system, and some of the other systems that are supposed to serve youth tend to, not be as organized and resourced as they might be.
So what is your position right now? What is it that you're doing in, well, I think maybe you're doing a variety of things, but what are you?
Yeah. Well, I do a lot of stuff. So, same as in Louisiana, one of my main jobs is just being a psychiatrist within corrections, which is mostly doing evaluations when people come in. And then, the traditional system has, the psychiatrist decision tree is sort of, do the benefits of medication outweigh the risks, and then prescribing medications or not prescribing. And because I do a lot of trauma-related therapies, I do some extra therapy, beyond what's available, from the on-the-ground therapists at the facility. And I always consider every interaction a potential therapeutic interaction. So I'm always trying to mix in, some therapy when I'm seeing kids, even if there's other stuff going on or if they're on medication. And in Louisiana, I was a little more distant. And thankfully, in Florida, I've been able to be a little bit more programmatic. I've been able to push some stuff into the program. You may not remember this, or maybe you don't know, but I first tried to sign up for your Louisiana prison yoga project training that got canceled when I was still in New Orleans. And the yoga studio that I went to, Swan River Yoga, had a lot of activists, and it's just a wonderful studio. And I heard about all the wonderful things they were doing in prisons, and I was working in prisons at the time. I kind of was didn't want to raise my hand and say, yeah, I'm working for the enemy or whatever. I'm in the middle of all this. And but they did have some people that are really wonderful people that are doing great stuff, and that made me more excited. There was real energy there. In Louisiana, I had people, 2 freshly trained yogis who wanted to do volunteer work at the facility. They filled out all the paperwork. They got everything done to be official volunteers. And I pushed as much as I could, and the facility would not give them a time or a guard supervisor or anything to let them come in and volunteer. So just to tell you, how, and the reality is these places are understaffed and they have problems, but it's also, apparently just wasn't valuable enough to the administration or whoever was running it for them to allow volunteers to come in for free to do yoga for these kids. So I was super frustrated. And when I moved to Florida, I was like, all right, I really want to get to, and I think I maybe, I probably was already on an email list or something at that point, because I had tried to sign up and saw that you were coming. And so I was really excited to be able to do that. And because I went to your training, I met people who were also interested in it. And not soon after, we were able to get volunteers to come to the facility and get a program going. So not only was your training really valuable, but it also brought people together in a way that then I was like, oh, well, we have people in town who are willing to do this, and we could, start doing it.
Yeah, of course, that kind of feedback fills my heart. So I'm happy about that. What are the ages of the youth that you normally are working with?
I mean, usually these systems really shy away. I've had kids as young as 11 in secure facilities, but they usually want a 14 to 20-year-old kind of population, right? In Louisiana, there were a lot of kids who were in for juvenile life, and they left at their 21st birthday. So you get kids in the facility kind of aging out at that time. Or if they have long sentences, they would go to an adult facility, and it's kind of the same thing with, if they've been waived to adult court, they may start in juvenile and then go to adult. But yeah, so 14, sometimes you get kids who are younger. The system really doesn't want those younger kids, but sometimes they've done things that are so egregious, or there's no place for them, and they, have no family, and there's a number of extenuating circumstances sometimes where they just, they end up in a secure place, which is not good. And so I'm mostly dealing with 15 to 17 or 18, though. That's the biggest age group.
Yeah. So what, one of the things that we really focus on, my work, even though I started out my first couple of years working with youth, primarily boys. Most of my work has been with adults and adult males. And really understanding over the years of working with them, the whole issue of developmental trauma, complex trauma that remains unresolved in their lives. And, the way that I look at it and the way that we look at it is that those original issues of trauma lead to survival behavior, basically, adapting a lifestyle that is that's survival, and that this, in fact, leads to criminal behavior. And I see so many men, who, the term arrested development. I mean, they may be 45 years old, but, they're still dealing with adolescent issues. And I wonder if you could just talk a little bit, from both a medical perspective and from an experiential perspective of really coming face to face with these issues of developmental trauma.
Okay, yeah. So I'll talk about it on two different levels. I mean, one level is the societal and group level, right? So kids that have adverse early life experiences are then often brought to schools in a state where they're really not able to be calm and go along with the program. And I think that a lot of schools are heavily populated by female teachers, and the curriculum, due to a bunch of bureaucratic things, has moved more to like bubble tests and having to sit in your seat and all these, and we have less recess and less PE and less arts and less music. And so a lot of the stuff that really could be more healing and let the kids get their energy out, and that we could help them learn how to socialize and use all the parts of their brains. And those who are traumatized to maybe heal a little in school, what you see is they show up to school, they're sort of labeled disruptive. System, kind of wants to clamp down on them. A lot of vision is sort of how to control the kid now that they're out of control, and we're going to control them. And I think it fails. And a idea that we want boys and young men and men to be competent and to have agency in their own lives is really like underemphasized in our society. And we're trying to control rather than teaching them the skills they need to control themselves and have agency in the world and to be competent in stuff. You need to be good at a lot of things in order to make it in adult life. And unfortunately, once we cycle with a little bit of punishment, the kids feeling that they're not welcome there. They feel, even in like third and fourth grade, a lot of these kids are, and it started with the trauma, but now they're having this negative relationship in school and they don't feel welcome there, or they're associating with other kids who also feel like we're against the school and against the teachers and against authority. And especially if you have a group of them, they're like, well, screw us, no, screw you, is kind of, unfortunately, their attitude. And that just grows through the years because we don't have systems to take them in, give them the right kind of mentorship and help bring them forward. And so unfortunately, they often get into a correctional environment really dysregulated, really disengaged. They're not readers. They haven't really done positive activities at school. They, haven't been off running the streets, and they have a long way to go to be socialized. So just like you're saying, it really takes a lot to socialize someone to be a competent, successful adult. And in some ways, males, the stakes are a little bit higher because, the way the world is, they really need to be successful and competent, or else their outcomes are much sort of worse than females. There are some statistics on it, right? That, when it goes bad for a male, the cost for society and the cost for them are more. And I feel that. I think all sort of male, that you were capable of doing a whole bunch of really stupid things when you were young. and that you could have ruined your life if you didn't have people there to help you, move forward, or to look the other way or help you out when you did do stupid things, rather than coming down on you and being hard. So I think that level of understanding it is really important. The other level of understanding it is that, of course, there's sort of set points that start early in our lives. When you have, when you're experiencing traumatic events that you can't process, it just revs up your body and you become hyper aroused and looking for trouble and who knows what's going to happen next. And especially when it happened young, it basically becomes part of the person's personality. They work all that into how they operate in the world and how they go. And yeah, maybe they have the symptoms of, you can click off of PTSD, but a lot of times you can click off ADHD, conduct disorder, opposition, all these other disorders too, but it's really coming from the trauma place as much as it's coming from any, desire to sort of to harm other people. It's usually coming from they're freaked out and trying to protect themselves, and they're aroused and don't know what to do with the energy. So yeah, I think there's so many layers that you can look at, that you can just see however you want to examine this problem. We're failing these populations, and it's not going well. And I'm speaking mostly about boys, but I do have a girls facility that I work at, and we actually have yoga for change at the girls facility, paid for. And because we transitioned, and I was working there when it was a boys facility, and we went to girls, we petitioned, and it's kind of funny, it's the state, and then it's a company, and then the company hires up, so we petitioned our company, and the lady who ran residential for Department of Juvenile Justice is really wise and actually a yogi and understanding, and she really wanted to make these changes. So we were able to write into the actual contract that they're supposed to get yoga once a week, and we got a drumming group in there. So we have drumming and yoga paid for with the girls, and it's really been amazing. And I think the drumming actually goes really well with the yoga, right? You kind of, in fact, once we started the drumming, I think it helped the yoga go better. So but yeah, so we that's what it needs to be, or what we really want it to be, is written into the contracts and made official and made a part of everything. But this is just a first step. We've only had this going for, and actually COVID kind of messed things up a bit, but we're back live, and it's moving forward. And so, yeah, it's been about a year and a half, I think, of that. So, but all the same stuff about trauma is true, and even more so with the girls, because on average, the girl population is a little bit more traumatized than the boy population.
Yeah. So maybe you could talk a little bit about, of course I could, but I'd rather hear it from you. Why yoga? What is it about yoga that is therapeutic, from your experience? And also, a lot of this is actually, there's science around this, but I'd really like to know from your perspective, the value of yoga. Yeah.
I think there's two ways that you can answer that question. One is, I have felt the benefit to myself, as a human being and going through all this. I sought out yoga in 2004. I was still doing my training, and I play a lot of, up until about 5 years ago, I played a lot of basketball as an adult. I played basketball as a kid. I love playing ball, but I beat myself up so bad. I'm paying for, every single day I pay for it now. But because of those problems, I was like, I need to stretch more, and I can't force myself to stretch. So I got to go to yoga and see if that will get me more flexible, help with my back. But I also knew that it had a mindfulness component, which I had not really been trained that much in mindfulness, as a psychiatry resident. Mindfulness is much more common and popular now. But if you go back to 2002, it was a new concept and not used that much. We also already had a strong history of research that talked about diaphragmatic breathing and the relaxation response, and they were used in different ways. And when I did cognitive therapy training, they were talking about using breathing exercises and how important they are to calm people. And so yoga was doing a lot of the same things that we already were doing in mental health, but bringing them all together in a non-pathologizing way. So I thought, okay, I'm going to experience it. And it ended up being like, a life-changing thing for me. I mean, I think it made me into a better person and sort of calmer and helped me, and obviously I'm in a high stress profession. I do see some, horrible things and have to deal with some stuff that's really tough. So, I think it really helped me. And then if you look at the data about yoga, I mean, first of all, just like I said, look at the data on mindfulness, look at the data on breathing exercises, look at the data on physical activity and movement. You have all those put into one package that all have really solid data about how helpful they are. The other thing is there's this issue of autonomic regulation. Probably most of the viewers are familiar with Polybagel Theory, or the idea that we have a complex system that kind of regulates how aroused we are, and it goes off all the cues. It's both inside, which we call interoception, and outside sensory input, then feeds all that back naturally, and naturally can guide us through life without having to use our sort of frontal lobe to navigate stuff, right? If you have to use your frontal lobe, it slows you down too much. You can't be thinking about everything all day long. And when it comes to anything social, those are really complex interactions and are better if they're fluid. Well, I didn't know until, years after I've been doing yoga, that, yoga is the one thing that seems to be able to increase your heart rate variability, which is basically correlating with pretty consistently how well you're reacting to your environment. So I'm like, okay, they got some really good physiological, data that yoga is a thing that can really be helpful with this complex system that otherwise really try to work on in psychiatry, but it's not that clear that we make a lot of progress with. I love psychotherapy, and I got a lot of training in cognitive behavioral therapy, and especially a branch called rational emotive behavior therapy. And in certain circumstances, it can be amazing, but with traumatized people, you really have to do body-oriented techniques, and you work also on the mind-body component of it too. And so you get really frustrated if you just try to do straight up cognitive therapy with traumatized patients, especially with the teenagers that we deal with, because they're cognitively, not totally at an adult level, and they're really aroused and they have trouble staying focused. And you just realize, like, okay, cognitive therapy is great, but in these populations, this cannot be the main, answer. And I've branched out into some other types of psychotherapy. So I think there's also great, some other more memory related eye movement therapies. There's other stuff that is really good, but at the end of the day, you're going to have to do something to help people regulate their mind-body axis. And I kind of, in some ways, learned the hard way by trying really hard to do cognitive therapy over many years with many people, and seeing, like, you get some success, but you just don't get the kind of success that you need.
Do you have experience with EMDR?
I got trained in what's called accelerated resolution therapy, which is an offshoot of EMDR. And it's kind of a quicker go right into the trauma, but it's based on, it was by a lady who had trained in EMDR, and she did so. And EMDR for me, in my practice setting, is sort of a longer drawn out thing that maybe like that some of our there. I now have one therapist who's doing EMDR in our facility. So I love EMDR. I think it's very helpful, but I don't do it myself. And this was a way to do a little of the same stuff, but in a maybe briefer manner. So yes, same ballpark. Yeah.
Because maybe there's a lot of people listening who don't know what EMDR is or what this alternative therapy you're talking about. Could you explain the two? Sure.
So EMDR is eye movement desensitization therapy, and it has a lot of like bilateral components to it, where you're going back and forth and sort of either somehow some may be distracting your brain or maybe eliciting some kind of brain responses. And so the one that I'm doing has one piece of that, which is just the eye movements. So you're basically like, I'm going for the thing, you go move your eyes back and forth, and you have people move their eyes. And it is the way your eyes move during REM. So when you're sleeping at night, your eyes go back and forth. So there might be some memory or brain consultation. So we're not sure exactly how all this works. But it also is distracting. And it's also, it makes the person sort of have something to do and concentrate on. And I can tell you for sure, you're more likely to get people to process traumatic events when they are doing eye movements, kind of visually going through it, than having them sort of sit down and talk about it. So EMDR and the one that I do both use these eye movements in a non-verbal imagining, and it's a lot of visual imagery. So you're imagining pictures, you're imagining things, or you're going back and imagining the trauma. And then hopefully over time, like imagining something new to come and get rid of the trauma or trust the trauma, or then going to a happy place. And then ending, the one I do ends with a lot of positive imagery about imagining the future, but it's all while you're doing eye movements. And so I think the future of these therapies is very bright, because they're not talking therapy. So the kids who are locked up, who have traumas that they don't want to tell anyone because they were illegal or something really bad happened, or it's too painful for them to say, they can still do the therapy. And it's the one I'm doing. Someone just asked. So it's called accelerated resolution therapy. Is the therapy that I am trained in. And I think there's a few other offshoots that do similar stuff, but I do think it's a great therapy. It's definitely can do some things that talking therapies cannot do. And so at the end of the day, you're trying to get people to basically, and there is this evidence of, so you memory confuse. So you bring out the memory, and then through the eye movements, you have to, because every time you bring up a memory, you reconsolidate it and remake it. So it's sort of the idea that you bring it up, and then you change it while you have it brought up, and then your brain can sort of remember some of the positive stuff and not have the negative association. And it allows people to tolerate even bringing up the memory, which they often can't do otherwise, right? They'll just block and block and block because they're going to freak out. But in the context of an office and well prepared and all that kind of stuff, they can do it. Which I think these things are amazing. I do think they have to be used with caution within a correctional environment. And I've had some, my experience is that you have to be really, because they still are going back into a re-traumatizing setting often. And you don't want to just open them up to that and then send them back into the yard and have something bad happen and undermine what you did, and also make them not willing to work on those type of therapies when they've gotten to a safe space and maybe can do it better. So some facilities are more capable of handling that and making sure that there's no re-traumatization and there's not a lot of bullying or fighting or other kind of stuff going on and feel safe. But if that's not the case, then you have to weigh any benefit with a lot of negatives. So that's why I use it more sparingly than I'd like to, because that's the reality.
Yeah, it's so interesting because it continually reminds me of what it is that we're doing in working with adults and the kind of trauma-informed approach that we have is really follows along that line of making sure that we minimize harm, and understanding that in adult correctional facilities, when you run a class, you have a class for 75 to 90 minutes, and understanding clearly that you're bringing this therapeutic practice into a traumatic environment, right? That everybody who comes to your class is living, the other 23 hours. And if you're only going in there once a week, the rest of the time they're living in this kind of an environment. And it just so happens that most of the rehabilitative programs in prisons are cognitive behavioral therapy programs. And so it's interesting because so much of the, you were talking about breathing before, so much of the breathing to bring about heart rate variability. And then a lot of the movement, you are moving your eyes because you're moving from right to left. You're moving up and down. I mean, there's a sort of a beginning exercise that I do while we're seated, where I have participants in the program turn their head from one side to the other and using their eyes, and even turning their head to one side and shifting their eyes to the other side, and understanding, because I can feel what's happening within me. I can feel that there's a shift going on. And even if it just drops people into a state where they're out of their rational mind and they're out of the mind chatter for that 75-minute period of time, and trust that the trauma that they're carrying in their body is being addressed by the movement and by the breathing and by the what we call centering practice rather than meditative practices that we're doing. And the feedback that we get bears that out. But it's a little bit more of of a non I just think that if yoga is taught in that kind of a way, and not really taught the way yoga is taught mostly in public, where there's a lot of jumping around and there's not a lot of concern about the environment in and of itself, where there needs to be a lot of focus, in terms of trauma considerations, how you set up the environment in which you're teaching and so on and so forth. But that's really interesting. And I'm already starting to think about other ways that I can include more eye movement.
Well,
in the
good. Yeah, so
practice.
it's definitely worth considering. And the other thing that I find interesting is that I have repeatedly tried to get kids to meditate and breathe and all this stuff in my office. And there's two things. One, I would react is that traumatized people have a traditional meditation can be very arousing for them and very disturbing, and they really don't like it. And so a lot of the kids really are not calmed by meditation. In fact, you start to do it and they're freaked out by like silence and nothing going on. And some of the experts who do this more than me are like, well, if you're asking them to focus on their body and they're noticing these tight places and these trauma places and they can't stay with it long enough for that to settle or go away, all they're getting is the arousal part of it. And they're not really getting to any kind of calming part. And now you've sort of turned them off from doing meditation. But with yoga, and if I can get a kid like right after they came in playing ball for 50 minutes at rec, and now they're really tired, then I have a chance. You have a lot more ability to do some of these practices after the physical activity. So I'm hoping in this future, we can do some arrangements where we can help get people the physical activity and movement. I mean, all these kids are at the age where they need to be moving a lot more than they are. And due to, many things at correctional environments, they end up, sitting all day long. They're in school, then they're in groups, then they're, and they're young kids. They really need to be moving a lot more. I'm also concerned. I'm concerned about all of us, myself included, having diverse movements and moving all the parts of our bodies and having, the ability to stretch into some of the poses that probably bring out more like openness and joy and all this stuff. And the more constricted we get physically, it can really be, the harder it is to access the full range of emotions, especially these positive emotions. And if you're not moving your body and you're very sedentary, I think that there's a lot to that. And at the end of the day, everyone who's in juvenile corrections is going to grow up and be an adult, and we want them to be hunched over and, overweight and not to, it's like, let's start them on a journey that's better than the journey that our generation went on, where they stay flexible and lean and able to use all the parts of their body correctly. And that's a great gift that yoga gives, that a lot of our other physical activity things are more like repetitive stress injury almost, because you're doing the same, if you're cycling, you're just doing the same thing over and over again. I love cycling, but that can't be your only movement.
Right. Yeah, it reminds me of Josephine Wickstrom, who teaches with us in Sweden. And she has a very successful program in the high security women's prison where she does an hour of Bollywood dancing before she does an hour of yoga. And so there's a tremendous amount of movement, and it's been very, very successful. And I'm wondering, have you been able to experiment at all with any kind of music or dance in the facility
Well,
there?
So as I had said before, I have two things going on. One is I was able to kind of get a group going, and it's not dance and it's not movement, but I do have a music group at the girls' facility that I run, where honestly, all I do is I take my phone around and we play songs on Spotify, and they get to pick the songs, So anyway, kids love music, and it's really cool, and I'm getting to see them more in their natural environment and try to do a theme and keep it positive, although kids these days, I listened to some horrible music when I was a kid too, but anyway, there's a lot of, if you let them choose, they want to do F-bombs and other kind of things that are not probably great in that environment. But so that's one thing. But yes, we need more. Dance is a great, vehicle, and for humans all through history of dance. And so I do believe it'd be great to have more dance. I don't have access to anything like that, but I did bring in this drumming program, and the guy who drums is amazing. And in fact, when he was at a different facility, they got to go to like the local, concert venues and cultural centers and fairs and stuff, and bring the kids out of corrections and have them drum. They'd get like standing ovations and all that. So that's our vision for the drumming program, because I think it's a wonderful compliment. And they're pounding, they're doing a lot of physical work on the drums, plus you're tuning into everyone else. So it's a real social event, right? But it's also, they get to do their own thing, and everyone gets solos and gets to, so I think drumming is a really great intervention in corrections, but especially in juvenile corrections, because you could have your whole life of, playing music. And in his program too, he makes the one before, not with us now, but he had them build drums one week and then play drums the next, and then build drums one week, play drums the next. Totally awesome program. I would, every kid who's locked up had that. I think would make a huge difference.
Yeah, it's like what comes up for me is like, it's one of the frustrations of working with the system, right? That there are all these therapeutic interventions that we know would work if they were allowed, like if you could have a full art program at a youth correctional facility and a writing program, I know a lot of these things have already proven to be successful, and music and dance and things like that, rather than what you had started out by saying is trying to fit everybody into this box of basically, well, the way that we need to prepare you for success in life is, you've got to get your GED, you've got to basically fit in this box. And so many people don't fit in the box. And
for sure. Well, and what they're doing after, because they're mandated to go to school. So then after school, to sit them in a group or in a lecture type format, or to give them more sort of didactic type thing where you're like, we're going to teach you. And a lot of the curriculums are very reasonable. There are a lot of them have like good stuff on, moral development, how to think, and resisting, but it's still replicating a school environment that pretty much all these kids hate and have failed at. And now you're putting them in groups. So I do think the systems are misguided in that we want to have them heal and have them have some positive. We want them to feel like, we're helping them move forward in life, and they're being supported, and we're letting them do stuff that they naturally want to do and are going to try that, rather than making them do things they don't want to do anymore. And what you're saying too about the cognitive load, a lot of patients are, on the lower, obviously we collect people in these systems that tend to be less sophisticated, lower IQ, all this kind. So we have these therapists that are very verbal and very good with these ideas and very cognitive, whereas the kids are very physical and, experiential, and, we have to go where they are. We can't be where the therapists are, right? I mean,
Yeah.
therapy's, I love therapy, but I mean, it can't be mostly what these kids get. I mean, it just doesn't work that well.
Yeah. 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 Brings up a lot of stuff for me.
The other thing, what you were saying about boys, and boys have a different relationship with their emotions and are not very tuned into them. And it's good for them to get that stuff. But you gotta, usually, if you're like shooting hoops with one of these kids, you'll have a better conversation than you will just sitting them down in your office and trying to talk about stuff that's a little sensitive and uncomfortable, right? And so a lot of the better conversations don't occur in these settings that seem unnatural, and that, and I'm like an old white guy to them, so they're cultural rich and educated, and however one, there's so many divisions. I mean, I feel like, and I do my best to like meet them where they're at and get along well with them, but there's clearly many that arrive at these places just like, I'm not talking to therapists, I'm not talking to psychiatrists, that's my, that's how they do it. So not reaching them.
Yeah. The value of sports and the value of movement where you can actually meet on that level rather than, like you were saying. Yeah. Kris, do you have any, distinct sort of goals for yourself that you would want to share with us, in terms of?
Well, I don't know what I want to do when I grow up. That's what you're asking. I would like to continue all this stuff. I mean, this is really important to me. I'm obviously on the board of Yoga for Change, which is an amazing organization, and it's doing this kind of stuff, on the ground in Florida, not just corrections, but veterans and schools and all that. So I want to keep doing that. I'd like to see the system move forward. I'm working with the medical, so at the medical school too. It is kind of crazy to me that they're still a little bit backwards in that they have these huge curriculums and they give tons of information to the kids, but they have very little on nutrition, physical activity, what you might call biophilia or nature exposure. We have this natural love of nature, and people want to be outside and they want to be tuned into nature, and circadian rhythms are a part of our lives, whether or not we live in houses and have artificial light. These things are really important. The microbiome, all the science is showing how interconnected everything is and how the whole planet is really interconnected. And yet we're dividing everything into little pieces of medicine and still giving, sort of more, it's almost like scientism though too. It's like, let's learn, the people should eat this many carbohydrates, this many proteins, this many. No one eats like that, right? That all that has been a failure, and for me, I've Michael Pollan's advice is better, like eat food, mostly plants. It's like, just if you think about eating food rather than factory made products, you're going to do well, right? Your body can handle natural stuff. And so some of these like very basic messages, in the same back to what we're saying about physical activity and sort of nutritious, broad physical activity, that's what our bodies need. Some of these really basic messages get lost in everything in medical school. And I feel like we're still, the current generation's wiser than we were, but we're still cranking out a lot of people who are overvaluing pills and surgeries as like the main way our medical system is going to handle health. Whereas healthcare, has to be, self-care. It has to be really you taking care of yourself, especially considering how adversive and tough and obesogenic and sedentary our sort of environments we've made for ourselves are. We have to teach everyone to fight against it, but you got to teach the doctors that first so they can help their patients. And if they don't get that message in medical school, I'm afraid that some of them will never get it.
Okay, so let's say Dr. Kris Kaliebe is given a job to basically set up an innovative program and facility for youth. in a forensic environment. Tell me what that would look like.
Well, so I think the physical plant of the place where kids go is quite important and often under-recognized. I would like it to have windows and air, and airflow, and look like a place where you can be calm in, and that it would be more of a calming place, right? So if you go into facilities, they're often stressful. Just to walk into some of the dorms are not the type of environment that you would create calm individuals in. And they have low ceilings and it's cacophonous. And so for one, I think the physical plant, plus I would make sure that there's opportunities like a gym that's fully functioning. So when they have rec, they can do stuff. And I'd have lots of physical activity program. I mean, I'd probably get them up. I mean, they maybe would be able to choose from a list of appropriate songs, but I would have theme music in the morning. I mean, it might be like, One Love or whatever, it could be something cultural that they would choose, but it would have to be like bring us together, common humanity, those type of things to get people to, for one, have a chance to like express some joy and sing and move, but also to drive home that message that we're all really the same, and that we, the people really aren't that different, and on the inside and the outside, and the staff and the administrators are not that different from the kids, and you're all, their success is our success, all those kind of things. I would want more arts. I would want more, like some music programs, drumming, that kind of stuff. Dance would be great. I would definitely want physical activity. I would tamper, like in Florida where I'm at the mental health and substance abuse facility, we do have, they have made some really good efforts to bring therapists in, which is nice. And everyone should have a therapist. And I really appreciate therapy. But I would say, I would like therapists who have some training in. They don't have to be rec therapists or music therapists or all this kind of stuff, but they could be, or they could use those modalities much more in their work with the kids, because I just think that's going to bring out, if you are allowing them to express themselves and you're allowing them to, create something, that's going to be more powerful for the kid than kind of sitting them down and trying to talk to them about stuff that they really don't want to talk about. And I think if we brought all that stuff in, at the end of the day, we could get to the conversations more when kids do have stuff that they need to talk about, right? So, if you could create a more together and collegial relationship with them by sort of delivering them a better experience. We do have a dog program too. They love the dog program. We have, our arts program hasn't come back after COVID, but the arts programs are great. So I'd really love to have more of that. And probably these kids too, we could be doing vocational training for all these kids, because there's so many jobs that are out there that we need to fill that young people are not filling. And I wish we were siphoning some of these kids towards stuff that would like actually put money in their pocket and give them a good career, and they'd at least have that there's a real chance that they could be successful in some of those, where they still often have a vague idea that they're going to go to college. But if they are really driven, maybe they could. But a lot of these kids have made themselves so far behind that it takes an amazing effort for them. They're struggling to get their GEDs and stuff. So, with the internet and with, libraries and audiobooks and all this stuff, people can learn anything they want to learn in life, but I don't think that most of these kids are really ready to get a true college education. They probably would need to go out and work for a few years and mature a bit and decide really what they want to do. But anyway, it's just like the rest of America, but sort of worse, that they have this diffuse idea that they want to go to college, but they don't really know what college is and what it means. And so, I think trades are more realistic for most of those kids most of the time. And we should give them training opportunities and help them get started on those. So, those are some of my ideas. Oh, and I'd feed them a lot better. Everything they get is, of course, following the student lunch, whatever the regular lunch program is. So they get whatever is the national regulations. But boy, some really good food would probably, there are some studies that if you take a school or an institution or whatever, and you give them natural, real food, that it's calming and people learn better and get, so yeah, that's my other thing I'd like to do.
Yeah, we have this famous restaurateur here in the Bay Area, Alice Waters, who started Shape and Ease in Berkeley, and her big thing now is food for kids in the school system and things like that. And she has gardens and things like that in Berkeley, where they're growing food that then gets distributed and eaten in the schools and things of that
Awesome.
nature.
Yeah. We could have a garden in Louisiana. They had more of the gardens and more culinary than I have in Florida. And I just think like everyone's got to eat and they got space for gardens and the kids love to see things grow. So I wish they were doing more of that. Yeah. Amazing.
So I think we'll probably want to transition to questions. I mean, I could keep going with other questions
Sure.
for you.
Yeah.
I think maybe there's a lot of people who have questions, so I think we'll open it up.
Dr. Kaliebe, thank you so much for being here, and you have so much wisdom to share. And we already have a couple questions that have come through in the chat and the Q&A box. So anyone, if this is your first webinar, how we usually do Q&A is that on your Zoom bar, there's going to be a little Q&A box down on the right-hand corner, and you'll be able to put your questions in there. So the first one that we had is, can you say the type of therapy that you do that's similar to EMDR?
Yeah, it's accelerated resolution therapy. So, right, it's that accelerated resolution therapy. I don't know, are you typing it in for me? Yeah. So I may get the name wrong, but it's Lainey Rosenwig who started it in Connecticut, and she was a established therapist for many years before she did EMDR training. So she mixes in a lot of wonderful stuff into like a compact version that's kind of similar to EMDR. And so far the studies are really good on it. And yeah, so I'm a fan. In some ways you might consider it like an EMDR light, but it's the same, similar.
Awesome. So like same or beneficial results, but just a little bit of a different technique, but born from the origin of EMDR.
Well, it goes faster at the trauma, right? And so it's in theory less sessions and more sort of aggressive. And so if you have someone that fits for them, it can be really good in a short period of time.
Awesome. Okay. Accelerated resolution therapy. I dropped a Google search in there and the name of the practice as well.
Awesome.
And then we had another one from Wendy. I really like this one. How can we advocate for implementing more alternative therapeutic programs in our state?
Well, yeah, I mean, I guess every state is different and the constituents are different. It's strange because it seems to me that both sides of the political aisle want prison reform and understand that we need to change a lot of what we're doing. So I don't know that it's really not that impossible to get some change. But I think and while things are changing, might be the best time to then put different therapeutic stuff in. So I'm hoping that there's going to be a big mindset change and a lot of change going on. And while that's happening, there'll be an opening to bring in more alternative therapies, right? Right now, everyone is kind of conservative who are the administrators, because they're like, let's just stick with, and I love behavioral therapy and cognitive therapy, but that's what they are mostly comfortable with. But it's mostly based on studies that are not correctional studies. So it really doesn't have that much evidence within corrections as a great way to go. But because of its acceptance, it's sort of like people are running with it. And so for me, all you would need is some administrators who kind of get it. I mean, a lot of people also in these systems don't want to stand up and just go, this system is failing and this what we're doing is not good enough. And at the end of the day, we kind of have to say that and say, like, we got to do better than this. And there's things that are not expensive. They're sustainable. Will help people, self-regulate and have more agency, go out in the world and do better things. And, hopefully the message goes through, but I think I think every state is different and you have to be somewhat aware of what the politics or personalities are in your state in terms of how you're going to deliver your change message. Because in some places it may be like cost benefits or cost, maybe your best way to say, because some of the alternatives are less expensive than what we're doing now. So yeah, but I think it can be tough because some people just don't want to listen. So
I feel like we've been witnessing that, or the few conversations that I've had is that so many people in administration know that the system is broken and they're becoming desperate. They're like, what we're doing is not working, so we're going to do a total 180, right? Like, so they're becoming even more open to alternative programming, or what can be viewed as alternative programming.
yeah, well, I mean, yes, I think everyone can look at the system and just see it as a big failure, and we're not serving the people, especially in juvenile. They're all getting out, they're all going to join society, they're all going to be part of the next generation. So let's make them the most competent, well, self-controlled and skillful people that we can when they leave the facility. Yeah.
And also, just to kind of plug what we do as well, if anyone on this call is interested in starting programming, you'll be able to, you can contact Nicole, our assistant director, directly. You can also fill out this facilitator application. We have budgets and breakdowns, like you were saying. It's actually a really financially approachable option of bringing yoga and meditation in. So if that's something that you're interested in, please contact us and you can fill out this facilitator form, just to put that little plug in there as well. And then we're going still. So we have more questions. So this is a little bit of a general question from Doe. She says, hello, PYP Sangha, James, and greetings to Dr. Kaliebe. Thank you for your time and sharing today. My question may be vague, but I was curious what your thoughts are on the benefits in the general of cognitive behavioral therapy and or body-based somatic therapy for the support of childhood trauma. So maybe the question is maybe just some bullet points of what you see the benefits of this program.
So she's, the question goes into what are the benefits of some of the traditional stuff like cognitive and behavioral therapy. And cognitive therapy, has a wide literature base saying that it has a lot of effectiveness in a lot of different studies. And it's based on the idea of how you think affects how you feel and how you behave. And so working on changing how people think is a very valuable, intervention. However, that's for people who show up to therapy saying, hey, doc, I'm here because I want to change myself. Tell me how I can do it. And then you say, well, we can do it this way. It's going to take a lot of work and effort, and you're going to have to sit and we're going to do some homework and you're going to practice and we're going to look for alternatives and we're going to notice our own biases and examine the evidence and have a Socratic dialogue about what are alternatives. And so it works, but in populations where you're forcing people into treatment, like in corrections, for people who don't want to change, if you're angry because you think that the staff member is a son of a bee, right? You're coming in saying that person did this person did this not, I need to change how I reacted to that person, right? We want to get people to that place. So mostly we need motivational interviewing and motivation enhancement work in order to get them to a place. And sometimes in these systems, they have to get more time, get restricted, get in trouble. And then they come to you and go, all right, now I actually care about, not getting in fights because now they added time and now I'm going to change. And so in reality, the cognitive therapy is you're not really doing cognitive therapy with a lot of these kids who are traumatized. Plus, the younger you get or the more cognitively impaired they are from the beginning, the less easy it is for them to notice their own thoughts and come up with alternatives and change. And that's a lot of the population that we have. So there are real limits. Behavior therapy is, once you do a behavior, you automatically change your emotions and cognitions that go along with it. So we're always doing behavior therapy and corrections. We just could do it better. And what we need is more behavior analysts who do an amazing job of figuring out, because a lot of kids are acting up in school in order to not be in school and get out. So when you kick them out of school, you just rewarded their behavior. So you can't be, if you start rewarding negative behaviors, you're going to get more of them. It's the same thing when people act up and then they get what they wanted. now you've just encouraged acting up. So the behavior analysts really break that down and do a great job. And so that's a big piece of what I would, if I was performing the system, I would have more behavior analysts. And so it's not so much behavior therapy, it's a targeted approach at behaviors and sees what's a avoidance behavior and what's, intentional, and what can people, what could the system do to not accidentally reward bad behavior and to explicitly reward the behaviors that we want, right? And most rewards are actually social. So really you can just mostly reward by like, hey, you did a great job. I love how you did that. That's super, let's move on. And so at the end of the day, though, back to the cognitive therapy bit, you can get people to come up with a new trauma narrative, and they don't blame themselves anymore. And they see that they didn't cause this trauma to happen. That this is just one piece of their life, and they're going to go on, and it doesn't define them. That can be a really powerful thing. So you get people to write that down at the end of trauma treatment. You're often getting the adolescents to write down a new narrative, and that has been shown to be very successful. So yes, the cognitive therapy can be really helpful. Once again, you got to get the person motivated and wanting to do it and willing to work through it, and have a system that like lets you have enough time to do that kind of therapy.
I want to jump in with a question of something that you kind of had offered in that moment as well. So you had said that, I guess I'm just curious of the numbers or the percentage of children that you see that you are giving like unofficial diagnosis to, like how many kids are struggling or are on the spectrum, or how many are moderately to severely impacted by their early childhood environment. Like, yeah, I guess just what are the diagnoses that you're giving?
So in juvenile corrections, it is a minority of, even at the places that's supposed to collect the mental health kids, it's, to me, mostly filled with kids that had sort of regular developmental lives, but were traumatized. And maybe like 20% of the kids have a true neurodevelopmental disorder, where they're on the autism spectrum or have severe ADHD, or sometimes you get like a emerging schizophrenia or bipolar disorder, or someone who has like such severe anxiety that it's disabling. But that's a small even in the places that's collecting the kids, intentionally trying to get the behavioral health kids, more often than not, these are sort of regular brains that have gone through exceptionally traumatic experiences and then have become dysregulated. But that's part of your job of being a psychiatrist, is trying to figure out who are the kids that actually are so impaired and have these neurodevelopmental problems that we really need medicines and other interventions. I didn't even mention on this, but I put lots of kids on like fish oil and magnesium and other kind of nutritional stuff. So you probably might imagine that I'm trying to supplement. I'm not just restricted to pharmaceuticals. And thankfully where I work, they have been okay with me doing that. But I feel like a lot of those, the risk benefit is excellent, and you're not going to do any harm. So I'm like, I'd much rather, make sure they have those and then maybe add on medicines as needed. But I am a supplement user.
Awesome. Thank you.
That's really interesting. That was actually one of the questions I was going to ask you. I'm just going to interject, Kris, that particularly going back to Doe's question, the way that I look at it, it's I think one of the primary aims of what we're doing in terms of body-centered awareness practices is for self-regulation, is for in trying to provide people with tools to regulate their behavior and to regulate the symptoms that are arising within them that they have difficulty dealing with. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, it can be really valuable for these, and if we can get them to a place where they can start to even tune in. Many might spend their whole time blocking off everything that's going on beneath their neck because it's all bad. They've just like, I got to swallow all this because I need to survive, and then they get so used to swallowing it, they're not tuned in at all. And it's a really important part of them getting better, is being able to start to tune in, and then they can start to not react and realize that they have a choice. But many of them are still on that reaction mode, and when they're there, they're literally prisoners, because they really can't stop themselves. And in these environments with negative stuff, they just react. Someone comes at them, they see hostility where there's none, and there's a lot of real hostility too. So when they feel that hostility coming at them, of course your reaction, if you're traumatized, is to be hostile back. If that's your cycle, you're never going to get better. So those centering practices are really valuable to not react and be able to think about things. Even if you just have a moment to think, that can change everything.
I think that's a view often sometimes that we take in Buddhism as well, is that we're always just a step away from anger or violence, right? That is just it's a choice. And so that's what I've always liked personally about these practices of meditation and mindfulness, is that it's really creating that space. It's creating that internal space to make a different decision.
Yeah, that's what it's supposed to do.
And then we have a really great transformative justice question from Roger. Roger asks, victims also experience trauma with all its enduring damage. Is there a time and place for the incarcerated, those guilty of crimes, to be brought together with victims in a healing environment using some or all of the activities discussed today? And I think both of you actually can chime in on this.
Well, I'll go quickly, and then James can go. I would just say that, yes, if we could facilitate that and the parties agree to it, it can be amazingly healing. I would love to see that happen. And that should be more of a piece of this, system. It should be a restorative justice system and transformative, not just, we're going to lock you up and you're totally separate from whatever crime happened before. That doesn't help the community really.
So the way that I look at this, and it has a lot to do with my background and my influence on the Prison Yoga Project, was that when I first started going into prisons and teaching in prisons, it was under a restorative justice organization and banner. And what happened was that I was not only teaching yoga, I was also teaching other kinds of classes that were geared toward restorative justice principles and practices. So one of those was called victim offender education. And one of the main focuses of working with offenders is working with them toward taking personal responsibility for the harm that they cause. So this is going to the question that you asked, Roger. And the great success of this program, so essentially you had a group, or I had a group of men, maybe 12 men, that I worked with over at least a year's period of time, week in and week out. And we went through a curriculum that gradually started out with understanding you were victimized, which led to you to victimize other people. And so that has its own course. That takes time for that to settle and to really understand, coming from the kind of conditioning and background that I came from, I was able to offend other people. The program culminated in bringing in surrogate panels of people who have been impacted by the same crime that the men in the program had committed. And a lot of the men in the program had committed murder. And so people who had lost a loved one to murder were brought in to tell their story about, this is how I was impacted by losing my son or losing my husband or losing my daughter. And then the participants in the program went through a process where it was called victim impact statement, where they shared, this is how I have been impacted by having committed the crime that I committed. And that it's been shown that this kind of meeting has a tremendous impact on the potential for healing. That victims may have when they first, even participants who came in for these panels came in. I remember one time that one of the people who came in as a panelist looked across the room and saw that one of the prisoners had on a new pair of sneakers and said, "Yeah, look at you. You got on a new pair of sneakers. My son will never have a new pair of sneakers because, you know, he was killed." 3 hours later, they were connected with one another and they were talking with one another. And that this is the potential that restorative justice practices have. And if they could be included more, particularly in rehabilitation programs, this program has spread throughout California and has been very successful in growing in California prisons. And there's they've had great success. And they've also had success in that those prisoners who were released, their recidivism rate, their return to prison rate is so much less than the average person who's released. So yeah, this is another one of those, the way that I look at this after having been exposed to doing this work for almost 19 years now is we know how to do this work. We know the innovative programs that have an impact and have a positive result. If the system would allow these programs, if the prison system would really, really, truly get behind rehabilitation, a lot of these innovative programs could be launched. But it's struggling with the system in getting them to accept these innovative programs and these proven programs. So I know that's probably a long answer to your question, but something that's really dear to my heart, because I feel that the work that we're doing in terms of through yoga, teaching people who've offended other people to, number one, start to develop greater sensitivity to themselves. So they become more sensitive to themselves as a result of practicing yoga and mindfulness, that is the first step to leading to empathy, to being more understanding and more empathetic with other people.
Just really giving that a moment to really set in, right? It's like we have the tools, we have the opportunity. There just needs to be, or there's so much potential, right? There really is so much potential, and we have all the tools to hold our community in healing. So thank you, James, for sharing that story and for your work. And I think we're approaching the end. So Dr. Kaliebe, if there's anything else that you kind of want to leave with our audience or anything that was left unsaid, I invite you to speak to us now.
Well, I just thank you all for having me. Really honored to talk with you guys, and you know, everyone who's interested in this wants to make the world a better place. On a philosophical level, I would just say, let's always keep drawing a larger circle around our common humanity, right? And not divide us into different sections. And because I find if you join a group, you end up being, it affects how you see things and so I think even though we all have our parts of many groups, but I think like for us to really be able to change prison systems, we can't see the people who run them as bad or evil or the enemy or any of this kind of stuff. They're trying the best they can. I work in these facilities. The people are doing the best they can. They don't have a system that works. We need to work together to change the system. We want to, if anything, increase resources, or, you know, and certainly if we decrease the population and then we'd have the same resources, we could do more. But, you know, draw a bigger circle around our brothers and sisters who are at the other end of these systems and work together with them. And I do think, we're on a path to change. It's taking longer than y'all like.
Thank you so much for making the time today to meet with us. Thank you,
Sure.
community, for being here. James, thank you so much for hosting this really beautiful conversation as well. I'm really just grateful that you two were able to meet and create this connection, and then we're able to witness all of the work of both of you today. If anyone on this call is interested in doing youth juvenile justice work, our training is open for registration. We have partnered with Yoga Ed for this really unique training. I'm going to drop the link in the chat right now, focusing on working with teens, working and doing yoga and mindfulness, and working and doing trauma-informed training. So that training is open for registration. And then we have next week, we have another really interesting conversation happening with Susie, who is our program director of Alabama. She's got a really interesting personal story. She was an educator for 20 years and in 2019 decided to put her education career aside and start working within the juvenile justice system. And then, as we know, the pandemic happened. So she was starting within this incarcerated world at a digital level. So she was teaching remotely to system impacted youth. So it will be in the South. So we have a really interesting story happening with Susie next week. And if you have or have not taken our foundational training, I think that's a really great place for our community to start. This is the view is what we really established through our foundational training. We talk about incarceration, we talk about mass incarceration, primarily within the US system, but we offer opportunity for you to dive in and research your own location as well. And then how yoga and mindfulness can really support the system impacted population and their families. So once again, thank you so much everyone for being here. Thank you, thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Good to see
My
you.
pleasure.
Great conversation. Thank you.